There's a phrase that appears, word for word or close enough to it, in the official reports of 12 separate Australian towns. 12 times, 12 towns, 12 communities that no longer exist. And every single time, the same conclusion. Nothing to see here, move along. What I want to do in this video is put those 12 cases next to each other, because individually, each one has an explanation. Canberra has an explanation for all of them. But when you line them up, when you actually look at them side by side, the pattern becomes something that's very hard to explain away. The disasters were different, the locations were different, the communities were different, but the paperwork, almost identical. This isn't a story about bad luck. It never was. In the winter of 1952, the town of Meredith flooded. That's the short version. The version in the official record. Heavy rainfall, river overflow, structural damage, a natural event in a part of Victoria that had always been prone to flooding. End of story. Except the documents that were quietly declassified decades later told a slightly different story. Engineers working on the dam upstream had filed risk reports 6 months before the flood. The structural integrity of the dam had been flagged. Internal memos circulated, and the conclusion reached by the relevant authorities, at the time not in hindsight, was that the risk was manageable. Manageable. That word did a lot of work. Not one resident of Meredith received a warning, not one evacuation notice. When the water came, it came as a surprise, because the people who knew it might come had decided that the cost of telling anyone wasn't worth it. Maybe they thought the dam would hold. Maybe the calculus was simpler than that. What's left of Meredith today is a small town that survived and rebuilt. But the farms that were lost, the livestock, the infrastructure, none of that was properly compensated. The report said natural causes. The compensation reflected natural causes. The dam was quietly reinforced the following year. No announcement. Wittenoom is the one most Australians have heard of, which is exactly why it sits here at number 11 rather than number 1. The broad facts are known. A mining town built around blue asbestos, workers breathing carcinogenic fibers for decades, a death toll that accumulated slowly and then all at once. It's taught in schools now, cited in workplace safety literature, used as a case study in regulatory failure. But there's a detail that tends to get lost in the retelling. Canberra knew, not later, not after the fact. The health risks of blue asbestos were documented internally as early as 1948. The mine continued operating until 1966. 18 years of continued operation after the danger was identified by the very government that was supposed to be regulating it. The town was officially deincorporated in 2007, decades after the last residents left, decades after the contamination was undeniable. By that point, the buildings had been removed, the road signs taken down, the names scrubbed from official maps in an attempt to discourage anyone from visiting. Here's the thing that stays with you, though. The government still maintains a register of former Wittenoom residents, not to provide them with ongoing health care, to study the progression of their disease. The people who were harmed became, in death and in dying, a data set. The town is gone. The research program continues. Some towns are destroyed by disasters. Lee Creek was destroyed by a spreadsheet. The town was built by the government in the 1940s, specifically to house workers for a nearby coal mine. A planned community, schools, a hospital, proper housing. It wasn't organic. It was constructed for a purpose, and when that purpose ended, so did the town. In 2015, the mining company announced the closure of the Lee Creek coal mine. The South Australian government followed shortly after with its own announcement. The town would be decommissioned. 2,000 people, homes, businesses, a community that had existed for 70 years. Given a deadline, there was no public hearing, no community consultation in any meaningful sense. The decision had already been made before the announcement. The process was just notification, not negotiation. What happened next is genuinely strange. The government sold the entire town, the physical infrastructure, the buildings, everything, to a private developer for $1. The idea was that someone would find a new use for it, That hasn't entirely materialized. Lee Creek still exists as a place, but the community that gave it meaning is gone, scattered across the state. And the official record frames this not as displacement, but as an orderly transition, a managed outcome. That framing is doing quite a lot of work. January 2016. The Yarloop fire moved through town so quickly that some residents had minutes to leave. 41 years of a firefighter's career, and the chief said he'd never seen anything burn like that. The combination of old timber buildings, drought conditions, and wind turned Yarloop into something almost unrecognizable within hours. 180 structures destroyed, 2 people killed. A town, population under 600, effectively ended in a single afternoon. The official finding, an extreme weather event exacerbated by climate conditions. What the residents had been saying for years before that afternoon was different. The fire management infrastructure in the region hadn't been updated to reflect the documented increase in fire risk. The equipment was dated. The response protocols hadn't been revised. Multiple submissions had been made to relevant authorities arguing that Yarloop's combination of heritage timber buildings and increasing fire danger was a serious vulnerability. Those submissions didn't result in investment. They resulted in acknowledgement, which is a different thing. Yarloop had heritage significance but not enough economic significance to justify what prevention would have cost. That calculus, heritage versus economy, is never stated in any official document, but it's visible in what didn't happen in the years before the fire. The rebuilding has been partial. Some residents returned. Many didn't. The town that existed before January 2016 no longer exists, and the inquiry that followed produced recommendations, not reckoning. This one is harder to categorize because what happened in Queenstown was so gradual and so thoroughly reframed that many people don't recognize it as destruction at all. The copper smelters operated for decades. The sulfur dioxide emissions killed the vegetation across the surrounding hills so completely that the landscape became bare-colored rock, pink, red, orange, purple, depending on the mineral content of the ground. Nothing grew. Nothing could grow. At some point, and this is the remarkable part, the Tasmanian government and the tourism industry decided to market this as a feature, the moonscape of Queenstown, a unique landscape. Come and see something you won't find anywhere else in Australia, which is true. You won't find it anywhere else, because most places don't allow their environment to be systematically poisoned to this degree. The people who lived there were never given a systematic clinical assessment of what decades of exposure to those levels of contamination might have done to them. Not formally, not comprehensively. The mining companies contributed to the local economy, the government collected royalties, and the residents lived inside a landscape that had been chemically stripped bare, and then, somehow, reimagined as a tourist attraction. The vegetation is slowly returning now, which some people see as progress, and others see as the erasure of the evidence. In 1980, the Australian government sent police to escort drilling equipment onto Canberra station. The Yungangora community, the traditional custodians of the land, had made their position clear. They did not want drilling on their country. They had said so publicly, repeatedly, through every available channel. The site in question held significant spiritual importance. The community had asked for it to be respected. The government authorized the drilling anyway, and when the community stood in the way, police cleared a path for the equipment. Internal documents released years later showed that senior federal officials were aware that the operation was proceeding against the explicit wishes of the community and in a way that contradicted undertakings that had been made, not formally, not legally binding, but made nonetheless. The internal language was careful. The public language was more careful still. The official narrative at the time characterized the community's resistance as external agitation, as though the Yungangora people needed outsiders to tell them they didn't want drilling on their sacred sites. The drilling found no commercially viable oil. The site was abandoned. What was left behind was a community that had watched the machinery arrive under police escort, had watched it dig, and had then watched it leave. No acknowledgement, no apology, just the holes in the ground, and a government report that described the incident as having been managed appropriately. The Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme is one of Australia's great infrastructure achievements. That's how it's taught. That's how it's remembered. The engineering, the scale, the vision. What the official history tends to pass over is the geography of the valleys that were flooded. People lived there, not indigenous communities in this instance. Mostly European immigrants who had settled in the valleys in the post-war years, built farms, established small settlements. When the dams rose, those settlements went underwater. The people were relocated. The government called it resettlement. There is no comprehensive official record of how many people were displaced. The figure in the historical record is vague, estimates, approximations. What was physically lost, structures, farms, community networks, was never formally inventoried. There's something precise about that absence. It wasn't an oversight. The scheme was planned over years, with detailed engineering documentation covering almost every aspect of the construction. The displacement of the communities wasn't undocumented by accident. It just wasn't considered worth documenting with the same rigor. The lakes that exist today are beautiful. The farms and settlements below them are not in any national archive. The people who lived in those valleys are represented in the official history of the scheme by the word resettled. The lake outside Captain's Flat looked fine. For years it looked fine. The mining operations at Captain's Flat had been running since the 1870s, processing copper, lead, zinc, silver. By the time the mine finally closed in 1971, the tailings and runoff had been accumulating in Lake Bathurst for nearly a century. The federal government had provided financing for the mining operations. State and federal agencies had been aware of contamination concerns. When testing eventually confirmed the extent of the heavy metal contamination, arsenic, lead, copper, cadmium, the regulatory investigation was conducted by bodies that had a direct interest in limiting liability. The government that had helped finance the mine was now overseeing the inquiry into the mine's damage. The residents who remained in Captain's Flat after the mine closed were never given a comprehensive health assessment, not systematically. Individual cases were handled individually. There was no community-wide evaluation of what decades of proximity to those contamination levels might have produced in terms of health outcomes. The lake is still contaminated. Remediation has been partial and slow, and the official position, maintained consistently for decades, is that the situation is being managed. Managed. That word again. In November 1963, government officers and police arrived at the Mapoon Mission on Cape York Peninsula and told the residents to leave. Mapoon was a community on the western coast of the peninsula, mostly Thanakwithy people, established as a Presbyterian mission in the 1890s. By the 1960s, it was a functioning community, homes, a church, a school. The Queensland government had decided that the land was needed. Specifically, the area sat adjacent to a significant bauxite deposit that was being developed. The community was in the way, geographically and legally. What happened next was described officially as a voluntary relocation. The residents were told they were being moved to a better place. Many refused. And then the buildings were set alight. Not by accident, not by vandals, by authorities. The belongings that couldn't be quickly collected were burned with the structures. The word voluntary was in the documentation. That's the word that went into the record. The federal government's role was one of implicit approval. No intervention, no objection, no inquiry into what Queensland had done. The bauxite mining began. Camalco held the lease. Mapoon people eventually returned decades later and re-established the community. The community exists today. But what was done in 1963 was done, and the word voluntary still sits there in the historical record, next to the description of the fires. The original Lake Pedder was not the lake that exists today. The original was a glacial lake in Tasmania's southwest wilderness, a quartzite beach of extraordinary texture, a body of water of a kind that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Geologists and naturalists had been writing about its rarity for decades. It was considered irreplaceable. That word, irreplaceable, appeared in scientific literature long before the dam proposals. In 1972, it was flooded. The lake was absorbed into the expanded Huon Serpentine Reservoir as part of a hydroelectric expansion. The quartzite beach is underwater. The original ecosystem, plant species, endemic invertebrates, geological formations, is gone. The decision to flood Lake Pedder was made at the state level, but it required federal non-intervention to proceed. And here is the detail that matters. Internal documents from the relevant federal departments, released under later Freedom of Information requests, showed that the decision to proceed with the flooding had been taken inside government 2 years before any formal environmental impact study was commissioned. 2 years. The study that was eventually produced was reviewing a decision that had already been made. There was a significant protest movement, one of the first major environmental campaigns in Australian history. It didn't stop the flooding. The Commonwealth declined to intervene, and the Lake Pedder Restoration Committee, which continued to advocate for draining the reservoir and allowing the original lake to recover, was told for decades that this wasn't feasible. The science on recovery has actually shifted. Hydrologists now believe restoration is possible. It remains a political decision, not a technical one. The original Lake Pedder is under 10 meters of water. The lake with the same name above it is artificial. The Daly River floods, it always has. That's the line. And it's true that the Daly River catchment has a long history of seasonal flooding. The community is aware of this, has lived with it, has its own practices and knowledge for managing it. But something changed in the late 20th century. The floods became worse, more frequent, higher peaks, damage that hadn't been seen before. The community, predominantly Malak Malak and Nauayu people, documented this. They noticed it. They spoke about it. They linked it specifically to upstream infrastructure works that had altered the hydrology of the catchment. Federal and territory infrastructure projects, built without adequate consultation, had changed how the water moved. Every flood was classified as a natural event. That classification was technically accurate. Rainfall is natural, river overflow is natural. But the framing erased the question of whether the infrastructure decisions upstream had made a natural event more severe and more frequent than it would otherwise have been. No formal study was ever commissioned to examine that relationship. The community's observations were received, noted, and not acted upon. The floods continued. The classification continued. Each disaster report read the same way. Natural event. No institutional negligence identified. You've heard that phrase before. You're going to hear it one more time. This is where the list ends. But it's also where the logic of the whole list becomes clearest. Somewhere in the interior of Western Australia, the precise location is documented only in partial immigration records and in letters written by the people who lived there. There was a settlement. It existed from roughly the 1890s through to the 1930s, the boom years of the goldfields. The population was predominantly Chinese and Southeast Asian, miners, merchants, workers who had come during the gold rush and stayed. At its height, the settlement had several hundred residents, a market, an informal school, permanent structures, a functioning community. It does not appear in Commonwealth records as a recognized settlement. There is no official record of its founding, its governance, or its closure. When the gold ran out and the mine closed, the community dispersed. Some went to Kalgoorlie or Coolgardie, some returned to China or Malaya. Where exactly they went in most cases is unknown. What exists in the historical record are fragments, partial immigration registers, letters preserved by descendants, a handful of photographs, a mention in a private surveyor's diary. The Commonwealth of Australia was, at this time, actively legislating the exclusion of Asian immigration under the Immigration Restriction Act. The communities that had formed during the gold rush were, from the federal government's perspective, not supposed to be there at all. Documenting their existence, counting them, creating official records of their settlements, this would have complicated the story the new nation was telling about itself. So the records weren't created, not lost, not destroyed, never created. The settlement didn't end in disaster. There was no flood, no fire, no contamination event that could be written up with a conclusion about natural causes. There was just withdrawal, dispersal, and then silence. And in some ways, that is the most precise form of erasure in this entire list. A disaster leaves evidence. Ruins, graves, contamination reports, damage assessments, even the ones written to minimize liability leave a trace. What Canberra did here was cleaner than that. The community was never acknowledged, so it never needed to be explained. No report was ever filed. There was nothing to classify. 12 towns, 12 official conclusions, 12 times the same architecture of bureaucratic absolution. What you've just watched is not a collection of unfortunate accidents. It's a pattern. And patterns, when they're this consistent across different decades, different states, different types of communities, they stop being coincidences and start being policy. Not every decision was made with malice. Some of it was indifference. Some of it was the ordinary violence of administration, the way large systems process communities they've decided don't quite matter enough. But indifference, at that scale, sustained over that long, producing that kind of consistent outcome. At some point, the distinction between malice and indifference stops being meaningful. The Australia that exists today was built on choices, and some of those choices required that certain places, certain people, certain communities disappear. Not always dramatically, sometimes just quietly, on paper, through the careful production of nothing. The last image I want you to hold is simple. A name, written in ink, in a private letter. The name of a town that Canberra never acknowledged. And then the page ends. That's what the archive looks like when a government decides you don't exist. Just nothing, where something was.